Welcome back and welcome to our next video on project management and the fundamentals of how to run a project. In this video we're going to be looking at stakeholders and stakeholder management. So first of all, we need to define what we mean when we say stakeholders. And you've probably come across that term throughout life, throughout business and things, but we need to make sure that we understand what we mean within the project context of a stakeholder. So first of all, a stakeholder is anybody who's going to be affected by the project. So that's the person or persons who are going to be using the end products, whatever it is that's produced by the project. So there may be that they are running that new HR system that's been implemented, or they are buying those goods and services. Secondly, anybody who's interested in the project is counted as a stakeholder. So they don't necessarily have to be involved in running the project or affected by its outcome. They may just be interested, and we will look at some examples of that as we go through this video. And finally, anybody who has the power to influence your project is a stakeholder. So that is, they have the ability to change what you're doing or maybe to stop the project completely. They certainly have quite a lot of power over what happens. Definitely one of our stakeholders. So combined, basically it's anybody who is interested or has influence over our project or is going to be impacted by our project. And as you can probably imagine, if you think about any of the projects that you've already been part of or have happened around you, that can be a huge range of individuals and organizations. So to start with, what we need to do is identify whom is in our stakeholder group. So those organizations, parties, companies and individual people who are going to be our stakeholders. We then need to assess them to work out who are the important ones from our project point of view and who are less important or less influential. And then following from that, once we've got this understanding of our stakeholders, we then need to work out about how we're going to communicate with them. What do they need to know? When do they need to know it? And how much information should we be providing or withholding from them? So on the screen now, what you can see is it's a rough copy. These come in many different forms, but this is a stakeholder analysis grid of some description. You can get even more simplified versions of this, but they can certainly get a lot more complicated. But for the purpose of this and understanding how this works, this will suffice for us. So what we do, along the bottom, we are going to judge each of our stakeholders by how interested they are in the project. Do they really care what we're doing, how we're doing it, whether the project works or not? And up the side, we're going to look at that influence, also known as power. So what power do they have to make changes to our project, to stop our project completely, or to force us to make changes along the way? So some people may have a lot of power and could stop our project dead, but actually they're just not interested and they're probably not going to get involved. Whereas other people may be really interested in our project, but ultimately they don't have any voice in whether the project goes ahead. So what we can do is we can start to populate this and place our individuals onto our grid here and start to make estimations. Now, of course, our problem here is this is completely in the eye of the beholder. As the project manager or as a member of the project team or the project board, we are guessing here. We're making experienced judgments, estimates of where we think these individuals lie. And of course, actually speaking to those groups and individuals may help you do this. So to start with, I've put on here our users. So whatever our project is, these are the people who are going to be operating the results of our project. So there may be that they are running that HR process, maybe they need to be maintaining that piece of machinery, whatever it may be. Okay, so we've said that as it directly impacts their workload and the way that they do their job, they are probably going to have a high interest. When it comes to influence, they don't necessarily have the power to say we don't want it or we do want it. That may be sort of foisted upon them by their management structure or by external organisation or through law and compliance reasons. Yes, they are going to have a certain amount of say in the end results and have input into what the project is actually going to, or how those outcomes are actually going to operate. So I've decided that in this we're probably going to have them as sort of a low medium influence, because they do have some say, but it's going to be in the details rather than the sort of the more strategic higher level ideas. I've also chosen for this project, which I haven't defined what it is, I've put the Health and Safety Executive here. So this is clearly a legal compliance organisation who, generally speaking, are not interested in your project. Okay, so you'll notice their interest is very low. They don't really care about your project unless something goes wrong. And if something goes wrong, actually, they do have a high, it might be, depending on your project, it might be extremely high, but they are going to have a reasonably high ability to influence your project, either the way your project is run itself or the way that the deliverables operate at the end of the day. If you're working in construction or with machinery, there's lots of rules and guidelines that you will need to make sure you're compliant with in order to keep the health and safety executive happy and make sure their interest in your project remains low. They can influence your project quite heavily, but they're not interested in doing so. If you mismanage them, in other words, you have a compliance issue, they might suddenly become very interested and start using that power in a way that may make your life as a project manager slightly more difficult or change the output of your project that you may not desire. I've put the project sponsor here as having a high interest and a high influence. The reason why they have such a high influence is because ultimately the project sponsor is the one who has given the project to the project manager to run. So they have the power to start a project, but also they have the power to stop that project. And they don't really have to give any reasons for that. There could be all sorts of reasons. They may be financial, a change of strategic direction, etc. So they definitely have a lot of power. And we would really hope that our sponsor is also very high on our interest scale as well. Trying to run a project where the project sponsor isn't really engaged and interested is going to be really difficult, and you should be probably asking why we're doing this project in the first place. If the sponsor's not engaged with it, you're not going to be getting the responses and the support that you need to make it successful. In this fantasy project here that we haven't defined, I've decided that there's local populations, so people living in the area of where you are building those houses or constructing that wind farm, whatever it may be. And I've decided that actually for whatever this project is, yeah, the locals are somewhat interested, but they don't think it's really going to impact them too much, so they're interested, but actually they're not too concerned about it. And because of the nature of this project, whatever it is, they don't have much say in it. Of course, they can write letters or they can ask questions. They may even possibly, if they thought there was going to be a problem, they may even put on protests and things, depending what that is. But for this project, I've decided actually their ability to affect our project really is quite minimal. So I'm not too concerned about them. I've put our customers in here. So these are the people who might be buying those products and services. So perhaps they are people who are visiting our website and using our online shopping facility. Maybe they are the people who are going to be purchasing and moving into our house or renting that property once it's done. And I've decided that actually at this point for the project itself, they're really not interested. They don't even know the product exists yet. They don't really care about it. Until it's there, they don't really care. However, our project, if it's aiming at selling a product or renting services out, we obviously need to take them into account, same as with users, and therefore the influence of those customers potentially could be quite high. I've put human resources on here as well. In this project, perhaps we will need to make sure that we can bring in additional members of staff, specialists, maybe we'll be requesting overtime, etc. So one would hope, because every project involves people and affects people, that HR would be reasonably interested in what's going on. They need to make sure that we're treating those individuals and staff correctly, as well as supporting us with resourcing specialists, maybe contracts if we're bringing people in, companies in from the outside. And also, because they're HR and they're about legal compliance, they've probably got a pretty good amount of influence over our project. They could affect our timelines by insisting that we use particular protocols and strategies when we're hiring or doing overtime or whatever that may be. So our next step, once we've put these on, and bearing in mind this is only a simple collection just to give you an idea, what we can see here by doing this as a grid, I've put some colours on here just to illustrate this point. We have some, like our customers, locals and HR, in this green area at the bottom left, where we're saying, well, actually they're not that interested in what's going on, and actually even if they were interested, they don't have that much power. So we've kind of coloured them green. We don't have to worry about them too much. Our users are sitting out here for this project, out in that yellow square, where actually they really are interested in what's going on. They still don't have an awful lot of power to do anything about it, but actually they are really quite interested. So we probably ought to treat them slightly differently. In our top left, where we've got orange, we can see that we've got, in this example, a health and safety executive, where they've got quite a lot of power here, even though they're not particularly interested. So we're going to want to treat them differently too, because we must make sure we keep them happy and either keep their interest low, or if their interest does rise, they're using their power to support and assist us rather than to hinder us or shut down our project. And of course that leaves us the top right here, which is red, where we've got people who have a lot of power and are very interested. It's really important to keep them engaged and on side with our project, because these are the people who are going to be watching what we're doing and have the ability to stop that project if they don't like what they see. So just to recap that and to put that in other terms, people with high interest and high influence, we need to make sure we manage them quite closely. High interest but low influence or low power, really good idea to keep them informed about what's going on, to keep them happy and just make sure that they understand where we are in the process. High power but not really interested, let's make sure we keep them satisfied. So health and safety executive, let's make sure we are following those rules and those laws to make sure that they are happy and satisfied and they don't feel the need to come in and do in-depth investigations, change our project or potentially shut it down. And lastly, we've got these ones in this green area, not a lot of power, not really interested, that's fine. But we do keep an eye on them. And the reason we keep an eye on them, because maybe throughout the course of the project, maybe they may become more interested in what we're doing. And possibly that influence could change depending on where we are within the project as well. So we either monitor, we keep informed, we keep them happy, or we manage them very closely. The reason why this is important is it takes us on to our next step on what we're going to do. Remember, projects are about people. It's people who are doing things to affect the way other people run their businesses, live their lives, access services. If we forget about the people, our project really it becomes quite pointless or is doomed to fail. So we now need to work out how we're going to communicate with these individuals and how to keep them on side and either informed or monitoring them, etc. This area that we've talked about so far, it's much more complicated than that, and in fact you can spend quite a lot of time just looking at stakeholder analysis. So remember that we're actually only looking at the very fundamentals here and the ideas behind project management, rather than giving you a full course on how to do every individual part. So for us, we are going to move on to this thing we call the communication plan. If you haven't guessed, it's a plan about how we're going to communicate with people. There's a number of different ways that we can communicate with our stakeholders, whether they're internal stakeholders, as in they work for our organisation, or external stakeholders, which might be external organisations, other companies, local government, or individuals such as our customers or the local population. So we can hold meetings. We might write and issue newsletters. We might lobby. In other words, we may try to influence particular bodies by going and talking to them, giving them access to information, etc., to try and get them on side to make sure that they're using their power and their influence to help us rather than hinder us. We might offer incentives. Let's say for some reason, whatever your project is, it may be disruptive to the local community. Maybe you're putting in a new bus lane, you're laying a new rail track or something of that kind of nature. And one of the ways that you can help keep the local population on your side and supporting that project rather than protesting is you may offer them some incentives, such as when this new bridge opens, the local residents will have a 5-year pass where they don't need to pay tolls on this new bridge, as a way of compensating them for the disruption throughout the project. Maybe some of our stakeholders have additional challenges that they are trying to deal with, and it may be that actually we can help them solve those other problems, which of course will make them view us, our organisation and our project in a more positive light. So understanding our stakeholders, their businesses, their particular wants and needs can help us influence them in a positive way. Providing feedback, so whether this is through reports and through meetings and letters or whatever it may be, but providing some kind of feedback that we've listened to concerns or ideas and we have actually considered those quite thoroughly, and providing that feedback and reports and updates on what's happening, again, can make sure that interested parties remain interested in a positive way, and anybody with influence and power is using that to support our project rather than to hinder. And of course, do not forget about the project board. Remember, the project board, who are the ones who have come up with this idea in the first place, are often highly influential people, maybe a board of directors or senior managers. The chances are that they have contacts and relationships at a level where influence can have the biggest effect. So if necessary, make sure they are engaged, because they're your stakeholders as well. Make sure they're engaged and ask them for help in managing some of those stakeholders. So the communication plan itself will tell us who we are going to communicate with, which stakeholders, which individuals. So who's the contact person within an external organisation, for example? What is it we're actually going to communicate to them? What information is useful for them? What data do we need to provide? What we do need to take into account, of course, is things like GDPR and data protection, and make sure we're not sharing information and data that is either confidential or commercially sensitive. When are we going to communicate with them? Are we going to have a meeting every week? Are we going to have a newsletter go out once a month? Basically, the frequency of communication. But we also need to understand why we are communicating to the individual. That will really help us understand who, what and when of that communication. So why are we telling them this information? What do we want them to do with it? Do we want them just to sit there and be happy and smile about it and say this is great, or do we want them to take some kind of action? And of course, the how are we communicating? And that's back to that previous screen that we saw, which might be a meeting, it might be a newsletter, it may be via a Skype call or some other kind of digital tool like that. It may be we just tell them in the break room over lunch or something like that. Okay, but we do need to know who, the what, the when, the why and the how. So we can bring those all together and actually put them into some kind of form or table. Now again, if you look online, you will find, if you type in something like communication plan, you will find loads and loads of different examples. The trick with project management is making sure you use the tool that works for you. They can be very simplistic, they can be extremely complicated. If you are building the Sydney Harbour Bridge, for example, you're probably going to have an awful lot of stakeholders and a very complicated communications plan. So the example that you can see here isn't going to cut it. It's not going to be in depth enough and detailed enough. However, if your project is something quite internal to your organisation, maybe it's about changing the function of some rooms within your building, a more simplistic communication plan or stakeholder information plan could help you with that without being too complicated. So as you can see here, what this particular example has got is the person, so the who you're communicating with. They've decided on this example the role or title of that person, the frequency, so when are they communicating, how are they communicating, what's the format of channel, and they've put some notes here. The one thing this thing is missing is whom is actually doing that communication. Is this the project manager? Is this a member of the team? Is this the sponsor? So it's useful to know not only who are you communicating to, but who in the project is responsible for doing that communication itself. Because the project manager shouldn't be doing everything. The role is busy enough as it is, and you're not necessarily the best person to influence everybody. Remember, leveraging the project board or the sponsor to help influence and manage some of the stakeholders could be far more powerful than you trying to do it yourself. So as here we can see, apparently Ben is responsible for communicating for every one of the major milestones to the Vice President of Communications, or sorry, whoever is going to communicate with Ben. And it's about the high level timeline, budget and progress. Okay, so how are we doing? Are we on schedule? Are we on budget? Are we meeting our all of our tick boxes for this stage of the project? And actually we're going to be emailing that. So that's probably going to be in some kind of formal report. And as it says in the note here, prefers to see the final approved files only. Okay, so useful extra notes to remind you what you can and what you shouldn't bother sending them. The next one here, we're going to communicate with Patrice Embry, who is our communications project lead. Okay, so actually that's somebody involved in communications themselves, and we're going to communicate with them every week. So every single week. Now what it doesn't say on here is exactly when, as in is that going to be on a Monday morning or by close of business Friday. But there's going to be a weekly check-in which is involved in meetings, and we're going to CC them into emails. So they need to know about final approval on milestones, or rather they're going to be involved in signing those off, and they're able to provide some strategic direction if needed. So clearly a very internal to our organisation individual. And the last one here, Natalie, who is a communication coordinator, probably works with Patrice. We're going to speak with them on a daily basis, every day. So we're going to have the weekly check-in meetings as well, but daily emails as required. So this is our go-to contact for our needs, questions and deliverables, and they pulls in others as needed. Okay, so very, very simplistic example of a communications plan here for you. Now, depending whom within your team, whether that's yourself or anybody else, one thing we must bear in mind is that every communication, email, spoken, handwritten letters, whatever it may be, is subject to communication barriers. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about individual communication barriers, but we're going to keep it quite short because this is a fundamentals video. So communication barriers can be all sorts of different things that prevent you from sending a clear message to the recipient and them understanding that message and being able to confirm their understanding back to you. So some quite obvious ones may be, if you're working internationally, you may be in different time zones. So you may be sending an urgent email at 4:30 in the evening, they're not going to get that. They're not going to see that for several hours later because they're not in work. They're at home tucked up in bed where they should be. Alternatively, if you're working internationally, maybe there's language barrier issues. So do you need a translator? And we've all heard of the game of Chinese whispers, where if you're sending messages through other people, they can become corrupted and the meaning at the end may be slightly different from the intended meaning from the sender. But also, if you've ever tried to have a conversation with somebody in a nightclub or on a building site or anywhere noisy like that, you'll be aware that it's very difficult to have clear, precise communication, and you end up using lots of gestures and getting the general gist of it. If you've ever sat in a noisy pub, you'll be familiar with the gestures where you're either asking or a friend of yours is asking if you want another drink. Words are not necessarily very useful. So if you need to have a clear communication, make sure the environment you're in is suitable for that. It's quiet enough to be able to do that. You've got the time and space to ensure clarity of communication, and that things like lighting are correct if you're going to be looking at reports and things like that. So as I said, there's lots and lots of things you can talk about with regard to barriers of communication, including prejudices and bias and things. There are areas in the world where women are not considered to be knowledgeable in certain aspects, and it may be, if you are a female project manager, you may struggle within that area to communicate to male colleagues who just aren't taking you as seriously as they should. So cultural differences. And also there can be barriers because of differing belief systems, whether those be religious or other spirituality. So a very big subject, but you do need to make sure you're considering that. And certainly before you sit the PFQ exam, you would want to do a bit more research on what those communication barriers are. And of course, if you want to be an effective communicator, which you must be if you want to be a project manager, you will need to understand these in much more depth than I'm going to go into here. So that brings us to the end of this, quite shallow glossing over of the idea of stakeholder management and the communication plan. You will need to do more research and will need to look at this deeper if you're looking to actually sit the exam, but it should give you a good idea of the stuff that you need to be doing if you are running projects in the workplace. And actually this idea of understanding our stakeholders and our who we're communicating to is absolutely fundamental and key to the success of a project. You can be the most organized person in the whole world, but if you're a poor communicator, you are not going to be able to get success from your projects. So do take this one particularly seriously. I hope you've enjoyed this video, you found it useful, and at least it's helped start your journey to being able to be a better communicator within your project context in the workplace. If you have enjoyed it, please give a like, consider putting a comment below. If you've got any questions, of course I will try to answer them either in the comments or in a future video. And we'll be back hopefully fairly shortly with our next video in the series. Thank you very much for your time, and take care.